Okay, yeah, so I'll present it here. All right, so we are glad. Yes, so hello, Jye. Hello. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay, yes, I can hear. All right. So you can, all right, so turn on your camera. So yeah, so that we can see you, or just only, yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, Jai. Right. So
Good
we are waiting for
afternoon.
you, right? Yes. So
Sorry,
you
having technical difficulties today.
all right, yes. So all right. So we are start now, right? Yeah, we are starting now. Right. So please.
Yeah, so hi, so welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about teaching listening.
Okay, so let me introduce you your first, Jai, right?
Sorry.
Okay, yes. So, good afternoon, our presenter and participant. Welcome to the virtual VT Show International Convention 2021. On behalf of the organizing committee, we would like to thank you so much for your participation and contribution to our annual convention success. I am Chen Tao as a presentation moderator. We are delighted to see you in like a virtual present today, especially in this parallel live workshop. We do hope that all of you will be able to have some valuable knowledge and experience and takeaway following the talk. Before the presentation, there are a few considerations. In case you have any question or concern about the presentation, please feel free to leave them in the chat box so that we can gather the question for easy response in the 5 or 10 minutes Q&A section. Okay, so please welcome Mr. Jye Smallwood in this 60-minute parallel workshop, which is entitled Teaching Listening Using Bottom-Up Processing. About our presenter, okay, Mr. Jye Smallwood is currently an English language fellow assigned to Vietnam. He's working with the Hue City People's Committee to deliver a course on communicative English and English for international relations. And his research interest includes corpus linguistic, language theology, historical linguistic and etymology, and complex dynamic system theory. For teaching, his interests are receptive skill development and teacher education. Okay, so please welcome Mr. Jye Smallwood. Hello.
Hi, thank you. Right, this is my first time doing this in a virtual format, so please forgive me if if things are a little bit haywire. Can I share my screen? Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, so let me start here. Okay, so we're going to be talking about teaching listening from the bottom up. Like Mrs. Tran Ho said already about me, I'm from the United States. I studied linguistics at the University of Oxford, and I just graduated from there. And I've taught in 8 different countries. And I'm currently pursuing the Cambridge Delta at the moment. My specialty is working with lower level learners, especially teaching pronunciation and listening skills, which is part of the reason why I'm doing this workshop. So for today's presentation, we're going to be covering 3 different, we're going to talk about what is listening. We're going to talk about learners' problems with listening. And then hopefully at the end, if we have time, we'll talk about some materials, approaches, and techniques that we can use to improve learners' listening skills in the language learning classroom. Okay, so what is listening? And by the way, I'd like this to be a very interactive kind of presentation. So please feel free to jump in, ask questions, share your own experiences here, or stop me if you need further clarification. Okay. So listening. Listening is a receptive skill. it is an active process. A lot of people, especially teachers, consider it to be a passive thing that just kind of happens. But this is a skill that needs to be taught to learners. And on most teacher training courses, this really isn't, something that's explicitly, teachers aren't really explicitly trained how to do so much. So the sub skills of listening include listening for detail, how to deduce meaning from context, listening for gist or global understanding, inferring attitude, feeling, mood, and predicting what's going to be heard in either an authentic text or a pre-recorded text from a course book or designed for language learners. So we have many different types of listening that happen in the language learning classroom, or just in general, really. We have interactional versus transactional, extensive versus intensive, and instrumental versus pleasurable. Does anybody have any idea of what, for example, interactional versus transactional might mean? Yeah, I have a comment here from Niam. Listening is the process of receiving information and understanding what you heard and transform it to others. Exactly, very good. Okay. Anybody have any idea of what maybe extensive or intensive listening might entail? Okay. Good. Yeah, guys, you feel free to speak. I'm getting a lot of interaction on the chat box, which is great, but feel free to speak up and just, talk to me, talk to me directly. Okay, so yeah, interactional listening is when she says, when we listen, is when we listen and then response. Okay, yeah, so just to clarify, interactional is your basic communication, where we are listening for social purposes. There is no expectation of anything that we might necessarily need from the other person, as opposed to transactional is where we are listening for an exchange of information for a specific reason. So interactional would be just a normal conversation between friends, and a transactional listening would be listening for, say, listening to what we would normally do in the language learning classroom is listen for key information, have the learners listen for something, whereas interactional is just like a normal conversation. The host is not allowed us to unmute.
Okay.
Is there a way we can?
So please, if someone have the direct question, so please, so that Koi, yes, I ask you to unmute. Yeah, if you have the direct question to the Mr. Jye.
Yeah. Can they unmute?
No worry.
We are.
We want to talk before, but now you can continue presenting. Okay, we can ask you later. No worry.
Okay, great. Great.
That's right.
I wasn't aware. Okay, great. So just to continue, extensive versus intensive. Anybody have any ideas of what that might be? That's a little bit more straightforward. So, sure. Yeah, so extensive listening would be, I would say, listening for a long period of time to many different kinds of similar listening texts, I would say. So listening to different conversations, and getting a little bit from each one, whereas intensive listening is listening to a longer recorded piece and really getting into the details of that recording. So extensive, I would say, is what we probably do the most in the language learning classroom. We have, we talk about grammar and vocabulary, then they do a listening exercise, and then we do something else, and we kind of repeat this cycle. Whereas intensive listening would be, watching a movie, watching a TV series, okay? So something, maybe 10, 20, 30, or, even up to an hour, if your class permits that. So we have this extensive listening and we have intensive listening. Transactional accessing information through spoken news podcasts, exactly. Okay. The last one, instrumental versus pleasurable. Any ideas? Okay. Yeah, so instrumental it's very similar to the interactional versus transactional type of listening. Instrumental is listening for purpose, listening for either education or information or because of work. Instrumental means we're listening to do something because we have to, whereas pleasurable listening would be because we want to. So we can think, again, music, movies, podcasts, radio, whatever. So just to recap, all of these different types of listening are the kinds of listening that learners may encounter in the real world. And we need to prepare our students, our learners, for these different types of listening and incorporate activities that will prepare them for not just, okay, let's look at a grammar item. Okay, let's listen to a recording that talks about that grammar item and answer some questions, but really, expose them to a broader range of listening as it occurs in the natural world. Any questions about this one? Okay. All right, let's move on. So, So I like to explain listening through Scarboroughs rote model. This was originally developed for reading, but reading and listening are very similar. They're both receptive skills. And the only difference is that with reading, where it's visual, but with listening, we're listening for sounds and trying to make meaning. But the processes of reading and listening are pretty much exactly the same. So today we're going to be talking about, we talked about bottom up, but I just want to give you guys an overview of what I mean by bottom up listening. So if we look at the model here, we have a rope. And this rope is the skill of the receptive skill. And interwoven in that rope, we have at the top, the language comprehension. And that means the learner's schema, their knowledge of the world, their knowledge of the vocabulary of the language, sentence structures, their ability to reason, their intelligence, their knowledge of the genre, okay? So all of those would be considered top down. And I'm going to explain this further. There are other models that kind of more clearly explain this, but I like the way that this is done. But from the bottom up, it's more of the decoding of what we see and what we hear. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on. So phonological awareness, the awareness of how we make certain sounds in a language, and how to decode the individual sounds that are unique, in my case, as a teacher of English, that are unique to English and native speakers, okay? Has anybody seen this model before? Has anybody come across this model? I think it's quite famous. Okay. Yes. Thank you. Good. All right. Yeah. So it's quite famous, but this is one of many models, and I just like to start with that. So again, just to recap, top-down processing. We have top-down processing and we have bottom-up processing. Top-down processing is the learners where learners draw on their schema, which is their knowledge of the world, a context, a subject, a genre, a topic, something that they already know something a little bit about. And obviously some things are more universal than others. And so you'll find, often in textbooks, it's either, talk about work or talk about education or talk about, talk about your family, something like that. These are things that everybody is familiar with. And this is what we mean by schema. And so top-down processing, when we're listening from the top down, we already know something a little bit about the topic, and we're bringing in our own knowledge of what we know about whatever it is we're listening to. And this is also impacted by our education, how much language training we've had, also intelligence and aptitude. Okay, those are all things that kind of go into our ability to process listening and reading from the top down. So the bottom up, though, this is generally where learners have more problems. And so from a listening perspective, bottom up processing entails two things, mainly phonological decoding, decoding the individual phonemes that make up sounds and words, and decoding discourse, lexical patterns, lexical chains, synonyms, grammatical cohesion, substitution, ellipsis, and referencing. So apologies if you aren't familiar with these. I can send you a link later, and you can look these terms up if you're not familiar with them. But phonemes is probably the most important thing to understand. And phonemes are to sounds as letters are to words. Phonemes are the building blocks of how we speak. They're the individual sounds. And in English, there's not a lot of sometimes there's not a lot of correspondence between what's written and how it's spoken, but the phonemes don't really change. The phonemes are the phonemes. And for example, you may be familiar with the phonemic charts, the IPA. Okay, this is what I mean by phonemes. Vowels, consonants, the individual sounds, short vowels, long vowels, diphthongs, the voicing of consonants. And these are the things that learners need to be able to decode when they're listening. And whether or not you choose to use the phonemic chart, or teachers, does anybody actually use this in their classroom? Quite controversial, actually. Does anybody have any experience with this, teaching this to their learners? Yes, good, yeah. So I mean, it's really difficult. It's a difficult decision because especially with lower level learners, you don't really want to overwhelm them with an entirely new alphabet. It's an entirely different way to think about how things are sounded out. But as teachers, I think it's important that we are aware that all of the sounds that speakers are learners are going to be listening to in the classroom are composed of all of these individual phonemes. So we're going to come back to this one. Here we go. But to sum up the difference between the top down versus the bottom up. So the top down processing is kind of going from the cognitive system, which is again our schema, what we know, what we understand about the world. And the bottom up is decoding individual sounds in order to make meaning. And these two systems, these two processes work in tandem. We do both. They work together. But the thing is that learners generally have the most difficulty with the bottom-up processing because this is not really what's taught in course books and in teacher training courses. We're not really taught how to do this, okay? And also, most courses focus on the top-down version of listening, I would say. Okay, and we're gonna, excuse me, we're gonna talk about that in a little bit. But in general, generally speaking, I think that there's an overemphasis on this top-down process of listening. This is overly taught, but learners really need bottom-up processing in order to be effective listeners. Okay, phonemic chart. So we're gonna have a breakout session for maybe 10 minutes. What are the characteristics of a good listener? Okay, two main questions, 10 minutes. What makes listening difficult? And what is the difference between a good listener and a bad listener in the language classroom? Okay. So,
okay, so would you like to, how many participants in the breakout room? So I can help you to share, yeah.
I think we can do 5.
Oh,
I think we can do 5 in each
okay.
room.
Yes, okay, good.
Okay, so everyone go ahead and join in. I'll be moving in and out to facilitate the questions. I'm muted. Hi, good discussion, everyone. I really enjoyed the participation. There was some really good insights that came out of the breakout rooms. So let's talk about what makes listening difficult. The first thing is affective problems. Students panic. Oh my God, they don't know where to start, okay? So already their listening ability is blocked, and it has nothing to do with their language ability. It's all in their minds. It's the, this affective filter that we've all studied about from Krashen. The other thing is that students often expect to understand every single word that they listen to when they're doing a listening task. And this leads to demotivation. And because we often don't necessarily need to understand every single thing, but most of the times we just want to get the main idea, the gist, or generate some kind of idea for discussion when we're doing listening activities, or especially, if they're doing a vocabulary exercise, we really only need them to listen for specific words. And if they try to listen to everything, they get overwhelmed, okay? This is something that Farshid brought up in one of the breakout rooms, the concentration. So, after too much listening, learners tend to kind of zone out. And I think that this is normal for everybody. If you are not really engaged with the material, it's not boring, it's not relevant, it's boring, it's not relevant to you, or it's about something that you're very unfamiliar with, you can get fatigued while listening. And at a certain point, you just zone out and you just stop. And again, this has nothing to do with the language learner skill. It's an affective issue. So this is something that we need to be mindful of when we design our listening tasks, that we're not, we ease people into the listening. There are clear expectations of what we want them to listen to or listen for, and that the material that they're listening to is engaging and relevant and interesting to them, and something that they want to listen. And so part of our job is to kind of create that environment where I need to listen to this because blah, 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 okay? And that'll depend on your teaching context, whether it's university or language school or whatever, okay? And the last one is the native speaker problem. When we speak, we tend to use a lot of filler words, that kind of thing. And learners tend to get thrown off by these because they're not, in authentic speaking, these happen. But generally in the language classroom, the listening texts are specifically designed for language learning and to teach grammar or vocabulary. And so they're very scripted and they don't have these fillers. So learners are not generally taught to deal with authentic speaking. So, when somebody, starts rambling off, or they start using like every 2 words or something like this, okay, that can cause confusion. So that's more of an issue with authentic listening. But generally speaking, if you're using a course book text or something designed specifically for language learning, you're not really going to get the fillers, but that is something that learners need to be trained for. Okay. So for top-down processing, this is where we get into the psychology of the pedagogy here. How can we deal with the talk that includes various ideas and the length of talk, which is too long? I'll get to that. I'm going to get to that, Hong Nguyen. I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Problems with top-down processing. So this is really like the pedagogical side of things. Before we were talking about just the mental blocks that learners go through, but with top-down processing, again, this is where learners are activating their schema. And if they don't have a frame of reference to what they're listening to, whether it's because of culture or because it's something that's irrelevant to their job or they've never been exposed to it, this is going to cause problems with their top-down processing. They don't have the world knowledge to draw on while they're listening to this thing that they're unfamiliar with, okay? So it can cause a lack of interest. The topic could be inappropriate for the learners, inappropriate in the sense that it's not relevant to the teaching context, your teaching context, or the learner's language learning goals, okay? Again, cultural background. If I start talking about, you know, a Vietnamese festival, but I'm teaching Saudi learners, that's going to cause a problem because there's no frame of reference, okay? Also making incorrect assumptions about the topic, again, for cultural reasons. So maybe they think that they know something about it, but in actuality, their knowledge of the subject is either faulty or incorrect or misinformed. This can cause a problem with their top-down processing. And also, especially in the online teaching environment, we have a lack of paralinguistic features. So facial expressions, body language, nonverbal communication. These things are very critical in inferring meaning when we listen, because we don't just listen with our ears, we listen with our eyes as well. You know, we're looking at the body, we're looking at the facial expression. And in the, you know, when we're teaching online, it's often difficult to get that body language across. So that's one less thing that the learners are able to draw on when they're doing a listening task, especially in an online environment. But just in general, when they're listening to a recording or something like that, they cannot see the participants and their facial expressions and how they are interacting with each other. And that can impact how much they get from the listening. So with bottom-up processing, this is the decoding. And this is what I think that we need to be focusing on. A lot of teachers do not focus on this in the language learning classroom. And so with decoding and bottom-up processing, it's the lack of vocabulary. So basically just not knowing the words, okay? So not knowing the key words of the listening text, especially not understanding the pronunciation. Maybe they've only ever seen that word in writing, but they've never actually heard it spoken before. So when they encounter it in a listening text, they may know it, but they don't recognize it when they're listening, okay? So not recognizing or misidentifying words or expressions. Two main causes of this: a lack of phoneme discrimination, going back to the phonemic chart that I showed earlier, where learners are not able to discriminate between a short E and a long E. Okay, this is something that I had to actually teach in one of my classes. I think Vietnamese learners struggle with long and short vowels. Okay, they can't hear the difference because this distinction does not exist in the Vietnamese language. So when they try to discriminate, it's very difficult for them to discriminate these phonemes going into a second language, okay? Also, contractions, weak forms, connected speech. These are called suprasegmental features. So when words link together, when words are elided or they're dropped, when certain sounds are dropped, this can also cause problems with listening. So for example, I think so if you're teaching phrasal verbs, for example, turn, did, off, the breaks are not aligned necessarily with the what's written on, you know, what we would actually write, you know. So we have 3 syllables, but that last D kind of goes with, kind of links into the it's. So turn, did off, not turned it off. That's not how we speak naturally, right? So things like that, I mean, that's a weak example, but things like that can definitely cause issues when learners are trying to listen and they're trying to understand where the breaks are in certain words, because this happens a lot in English especially. So they have difficulties with interpreting the meaning of syllables, stress, intonation, inferring mood from the tone of voice, and these things, these bigger things at the sentence level stress, for example. So in the case of Vietnamese, this is very difficult for Vietnamese learners because, as we know, Vietnamese is a what we call a syllable timed language. There's no really sense of stress in words. They just kind of come out. Whereas English is what we call a stress timed language, where there's a rhythm that goes up and goes down. Okay, so learners need to be trained to understand that there's a difference between how we stress words, how the stress of a word can change it from a noun to a verb, and things like that. So all of these things together impact learners' ability to process from the bottom up and to decode what they hear in a listening task. Okay, that was a lot of information. Are there any questions about either top-down or bottom-up processing? Any comments? Is this new information for most people? Excellent, great. So let's move on. So what makes a good listener? Yeah, so good listeners, they're good at both. They're good at top-down and bottom-up processing. Like I said before, we use both of these processes together. It's natural, but obviously, I think for most learners, and we're going to talk about this, the bottom-up part is what makes it difficult. And because we are, all those of us here, we're teachers or professionals, we're good at our language that we teach. And so for us as native speakers of our language, the bottom-up processing is, it's automatic. It just happens. We're so used to it that it's effortless, it's quick, it doesn't take up any kind of cognitive capacity to do. It makes little demand of our working memory. So good listeners are able to, easily, they know the words, they don't have to think about it. They've come across it a million times and they can just, they can move on. They're not blocked by decoding. Oops, go back, sorry. They're not blocked by the individual words or sounds. So therefore, because the bottom-up processing is so good, their resources are freed for those top-down processes that they can focus on the bigger picture of what's being said. The mood, predicting, inferring, all of those things that we generally expect learners to be able to do. But in order for them to do that, they need to be able to decode phonemes very quickly and efficiently. So we can therefore use top-down processing. So good listeners are able to use their top-down processing to compensate if they have a problem with their bottom-up decoding. So for example, if they miss a word or they didn't understand the grammar exactly, they can compensate by, again, drawing on what they know about the subject and what they know about the language to kind of compensate for whatever it is that they missed. This is in contrast to bad listeners. So bad listeners in the classroom, they are bad at decoding and they know it. And so this impacts their effective, the effective filter that we talked about. So already they're at a disadvantage because they already have in their mind that they're going to be overwhelmed by whatever it is they're going to be listening to. Okay. So they're bad at top-down processing because decoding takes up so much of their time, so much of their cognitive capacity. So they spend so much time trying to understand and really listen to what's being spoken to that they miss the main idea, they miss the main point, okay? And this goes into the top-down, the top-down processing. They can't use the top-down processing to compensate because, again, they're spending so much time trying to understand the individual sounds or individual words, or any of those super segmental features, the connected speech that we mentioned in the last slide. So this can mean that they ignore context and they just don't employ processing in the most efficient way. So therefore, and I think this is the case for most listeners, we need to focus on decoding skills first before we do any work on top-down processing. So what can we do? So this moves into our last part, the techniques, approaches, materials. Our goal as teachers of listening is to help our learners understand fast, messy, authentic speech, which is much more varied and unpredictable than what they need to be in order to be intelligible. Okay, so again, I think what Kelsa Marcia is saying here is that our goal when we teach learning, it's to become comfortable with this ambiguity of not necessarily knowing everything that we're going to be able to hear and just trying to make the most of it. Okay, but at the same time, we don't necessarily expect learners to be able to produce what they hear. Learners don't necessarily need to be able to sound like native speakers. And so when we do the listening activities, we can use them to model pronunciation, but in general, it's much more effective when we focus on listening as a skill, listening solely as a skill, rather than as trying to get them to sound like sound American or sound British. Okay, this is not really the goal. Okay, the goal is to be intelligible, but really when we're listening, it's a separate system altogether. Caldwell developed what's called the Botanic Metaphor. You can read this in his book. I think it's called A Syllabus for Decoding Listening. And I really like this because he talks about how we tried to move learners from the greenhouse to the jungle. And we can think of the greenhouse as the language learning classroom. Everything is specifically designed to be clear and orderly and effective so that learners, they already have the vocabulary and they're just listening for, something we've already discussed in class. They've already been taught. But really, we need to move them over to the jungle, which is more of the real life, that messy, authentic speech that they're actually going to encounter in the real world. So I highly recommend, if you don't know this one already, I highly recommend you guys check out this book, A Syllabus for Decoding Listening. And he talks about how to move from the greenhouse to the garden to the jungle. And I don't have the audio files to show you here, but you can find this on YouTube if you just Google Caldwell or Botanic Metaphor. I found this quite interesting. And this is really what we do in the language learning classroom, but we kind of get stuck in the greenhouse. And this doesn't help our learners when they actually have to go into the real world, and they go into the real world jungle and they hear native speakers or very advanced speakers, and the speech is not going to be 100% intelligible and clear and precise.
Okay, sorry, Jye, you just only have the 5 minutes. So
Okay.
please, yeah, so great.
So, all right, so general advice, we're almost done. General advice, make sure that you're teaching listening, not testing listening, okay? A lot of the course books that we use are focused on testing listeners for their comprehension of the vocabulary or grammar that they've been taught. The course books themselves don't necessarily teach them those bottom-up processing, those decoding skills that we talked about in the other slides. Especially for those of you who did the Cambridge CELTA. If you've done any further training beyond the CELTA, you'll know that on the CELTA, you're really only taught to assess listening, not teach it. Okay, so it's very important that, as teachers in our professional development, we become more aware of how listening is a very unique skill and how learners need to be able to decode and parse the individual sounds, okay? Learners need to decode a range of spoken text. Like we said, all those different types of listening that we talked about in the first slide or so. So learners need to be exposed to a lot of different types: extensive, intensive, interactional, transactional, instrumental, pleasurable, maybe, find a way to make it pleasurable, but really just need to be exposed to a broad range of different types of listening. Both authentic and also, designed for the language learning classroom. To help learners recognize individual sounds. I think we've already talked about this, so I'm going to skip that one. One activity that I like to do is the minimal pairs activity. Has anybody seen this before? I find this very useful for teaching my lower level Vietnamese learners, because they often have difficulty with the B and the P minimal pairs, but also the final sounds as well. And so for this activity, this is something that you can use in your classroom. You pick a city, and you can probably change this to Vietnamese towns or wherever you want. But here we have American cities. Choose a city, and then I say, for example, buy, pig, cab, pit. Very quickly, naturally. And the learners need to tell me where did they end up, okay? And this is good. And then obviously they can practice this in pairs and in small groups. And this is good to raise their awareness of phoneme discrimination and practice, listening for difficult phonemes that may not be in their first language, okay? So if anyone wants a copy of this, I'm obviously gonna make this available somehow, but I think this is a good activity, okay? So the last one other thing that we can do is a dictation or dictogloss. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, where we read, basically we read from a text, or we say something and we have the learners write down what they hear, okay? We can do this in a variety of different ways, but the general idea is that they are thinking about what they heard and they're trying to make sense of it. What I like to do is I like to have a text, read it 3 times. The first time they just listen. The second time they write down what they hear. The third time they check to make sure that they got it right, and then have them compare in groups or pairs to make sure that everyone has the same, heard the same thing. So this is something that I think is highly effective. It's very basic, but I think it's very effective. Okay, so we don't have time for the final activity, but I wanted to originally, I wanted to put you guys in groups and show you 3 different listening activities from different books and have you compare them and ask you these questions. But maybe you can just do this on your own. The next time you open your course book and you go to a listening activity, ask yourself, is this teaching listening or testing listening? Is the focus on top-down or bottom-up listening? After this task, what should they be better able to do? Will they be better listeners for having done this activity? Or is it really just practicing vocabulary or grammar, okay? And then the last one, think about how we can make those activities more appropriate for our learners. Okay. Thank you all.
Okay, Jye. Yeah, thank you so much. Yes. Okay. I think because we start later in maybe 5 minutes. So okay.
Sure.
Yeah, Jye. So you see in the chat box there are some questions. Yes. So the first from the Huang. Yeah, that is student. Right? So how can we deal with the talk that includes various ideas and the length of talk is too long when taking the listening test? Yes, and some of okay. So from the speaker Van Nhật Khánh, please share your presentation as well, your email address. Okay, so
Yeah.
Jye, please show your email address on the screen. And if the some any participant so maybe interested in your presentation, so you it can contact you. Okay, so that is the time, because due to the limited time, so we don't have the time to. Okay, so Q&A section, and thank you so much for the great presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming.
Okay, so please, because you know that if we can contact with the Jye with the his address, email address on the chat box. So please, all right. Okay, so thank you again.
Thank you very much. Please feel free to email me any questions or for a copy of this presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so wish you the best. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you and goodbye.